Go in
Can you hear
your
me?
notes, please. We're going to talk tonight about John Knox. I studied today.
Pastor, can you hear
I
me?
learned a lot of this class. You won't believe. I'm always trying to learn, I have to say. I'm always trying to build my understanding of things. And I was really challenged with the life of John Knox. So if you want to, you can go to chapter, this is in chapter 29 in our book. But I'm going to give a little intro of John Knox before we do get to the book. But I'll tell you the page where we're at. We're on about page 312. That's where we'll be with John Knox. Now, John Knox was a controversial reformer. And we can also say this, and you'll need to know this, that he could be considered really the founder of the Presbyterian Church, in the sense that the term Presbyterian is going to arise out of the Scottish Church because of his form of government. And so the term Presbyterian, from my understanding, was used around 1560, and it was used first in the Scottish Presbyterians. But John Knox did not set out to be a leader. He actually was a tutor for two young men. These young men were the sons of wealthy men, wealthy noblemen. And these two young men became part of a conspiracy to take St. Andrew's Castle, because St. Andrew's Castle was the residence of the Roman Catholic leader of Scotland, the cardinal of the land. Meanwhile, while John Knox was a tutor of these two young men, he also became very familiar and started to lean toward the teachings of a Protestant called John Wishart. And forgive me if I'm saying his name incorrectly, but that's in our book on page 312. Wishart taught the Protestant doctrines, and he even accompanied Wishart to protect him from being taken and martyred by this Roman Catholic cardinal who was living in St. Andrew's Castle. That cardinal was called David. His name was David Beaton. So this is
Pastor,
this
what
is
is
John Knox,
What's the
armed with a
Protestant doctrine?
double-handed broadsword. He was a bodyguard. So here he is, a bodyguard and a tutor, a bodyguard for a Protestant preacher under threat of death, and a tutor of two young men who were taking part secretly in some kind of a conspiracy to have this Roman Catholic cardinal taken. So here's this St. Andrew's Castle. It's a famous site in Scotland. It was built in around the 13th century, and it became the official residence of Scotland's leading religious leaders. So basically, the Cardinal Beaton took Wishart, finally arrested him and burned him in 1546. Now, John Knox was about 32 years old at the time. So he was a young man in his youth. He had maturity. At that age, you have both strength and maturity. It's a good age, 32. It's about how old Jesus was, right? When he, 33. That's like the perfect age, I believe, actually. So he was full of strength. And when Wishart was executed, this profoundly affected John Knox, as well as all of Scotland, as well as his two young men he was tutoring. Remember these two guys. So within 2 to 3 months after Wishart's martyrdom, then Beaton they attacked the castle, the Protestants, and they brutally murdered the Roman Catholic Cardinal Beaton. They murdered him. The Protestant conspirators took control of the castle. Now, Knox was not a part of that. Knox was not a part of the murder or the conspiracy. But when it happened, it affected him because the two young men he was tutoring were sympathetic toward it. I don't exactly know if they had a plan in it, but they were sympathetic. And then, and here it is, this is going to change Knox's life. He is ordered to take the 2 young men he was tutoring and take them to St. Andrew's Castle. Knox was just going to take them there and leave. He wasn't planning to stay, but once he got there, he got caught up in the events. And then they saw that he knew the word of God, and they asked him to stay and be a leader amongst them. Now, this was not Knox's inclination. He wanted to study. He was maybe more like Calvin in his temperament. And he wasn't even sure that God had called him to preach or to do this. And he was resisting this with tears. He was like, tears. It's in one place that I read. And he did not want to do it, but he was persuaded to preach in the town of St. Andrews to these soldiers that had taken over St. Andrew's Castle. And when he preached, he stirred the soldiers. He pulled no punches. And he called the Roman Catholic Church the synagogue of Satan. One observer said that whereas others sniped at the outer branches of the papacy, Knox struck at the root. He was a very courageous man, and he was bold, and he was controversial, and he struck at the root of Romanism. And he said, Rome is the synagogue of Satan. He pulled no punches. This launched his career. This message he gave there in St. Andrew's Castle, and it made him the leader of this Protestant movement in Scotland, a turning point of his life. And from that point on, he saw himself as called to preach because he knew it wasn't within him. The compulsion was only God's calling in his life. So there they were now. They were in this castle, but there was all kinds of political stuff going on. And basically what happens is, Scotland kind of was the fighting ground, I think, between France and England. And I'm somewhat confused with a lot of that history. And it's a lot of complication. Politics is very complicated, But basically what happened is this. France came, stormed the castle, and Knox was taken a prisoner. And Knox spent 19 months in cruel labor as a galley slave in a ship. 19 months, cruel labor. Finally, though, England interceded, and he was released after 19 months. Now, an interesting anecdote I read of this is that because, the Frenchmen were Catholic, and he's obviously Protestant, right? So it was the Catholics attacking the Protestants. And when he was a galley slave, they said, here, take this wooden painted image of Mary and kiss the feet of this idol. And he said, trouble me not. Such an idol is accursed. I will not even touch it. And so they violently thrust this idol into his lap. And so he took the idol in his hands. He said, let this lady now save herself. And she's light enough to learn how to swim. And he threw the idol in the water. He threw it overboard into the water. And after that, nobody bothered him to worship the Roman Catholic idols. So when he was released through English intervention, he went to England and he became the personal chaplain of the King of England. By now, he's well known. He was well known in Scotland. He had been a prisoner, suffering for his faith. So he goes to England kind of like as a hero, right? And he becomes the royal chaplain of King Edward, who was also a Protestant. But then King Edward dies, and who takes his place but Bloody Mary? Remember Bloody Mary? She tried to, and back then too, England was going back and forth between Protestantism and the Roman Catholics. So King Edward was a Protestant, but Bloody Mary came in, she was a Catholic. So then Knox had to flee England, and he went into exile. But where did he go? He went to Geneva, Switzerland. Who was living in Geneva, Switzerland at the time? John Calvin. This was Calvin. Calvin, if you look at the dates, actually, Knox was born before Calvin was born. And then Calvin died before Knox died. So they were contemporaries. Calvin was younger than Knox, and did not live as long as Knox. I believe that's correct. So anyway, he was influenced by the Protestant and Calvinist theology of Calvin in Geneva. And then finally, he went back to England he went back to Scotland. Now, this is 1559. In 1559, so he's what, 14, 24, 34, 44, 54. He's like 45 years old, around in there. He goes back to England or Scotland, and he preaches another sermon. And basically the result of that sermon is it was so effective that and because again, Scotland had gone back and forth between Romanism and the Protestant Reformation, but his sermon was so effective that the congregation demolished all the altars, they smashed the images, the statues, the crucifixes, they removed all the superstitions of Romanism, and Knox was embraced, and then he went on to lead the Protestant Reformation in Scotland, 1559. And as I said earlier, the term Presbyterian actually started to come about around 1560, just about a year after that. So I was talking to Jamie Marnock today. Jamie is of Scottish descent, and I just wanted to bounce a few things off of him. And he said when he was recently in Scotland, he went to one of these churches, and it was as dead as a doornail. He said it was as liturgical as almost the Roman Catholics. So, that's the thing with these Protestants. Sometimes a lot of them were courageous at that moment, but they didn't make clean breaks with Roman Catholicism. And so over time, they've kind of drifted back to becoming more like Rome, sad to say. So that's a little bit of the history, and I thought it was interesting. And Knox said, dangerous times demand vigorous faith. Dangerous times demand vigorous faith. So there's that same quote. So any comments or questions about John Knox? Oh, what I just shared about him there? That was just a little intro. We'll get into the notes now on page 27, unless you have any comments or questions. I thought the thing that was interesting is just how God is sovereign in our lives, and he does order, he orders circumstances. So God sovereignly had him tutor these boys. God sovereignly had him bring those boys to the cat, and then that whole thing, it was just really God at work and drawing him into making a clear break with Rome. And though I'm not a Presbyterian, and I'll never be one, I was raised Presbyterian, actually. But we can admire the faith, because I do believe that Knox was a believer, without a doubt. He was a believer, and I can admire his courage to stand. And he stood before kings and queens, and we'll see one of the quotes as well of Mary, Queen of Scots. I mean, he was not ashamed of the gospel. Charlie, did you want to make a comment?
No, I was gonna ask.
So he's not. You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, hold up. Okay, I had to unmute myself. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Charlie.
No, I was just gonna ask. So he's not necessarily a Calvinist in the sense of what we think of today of a hyper Calvinist, but he was something more of a biblicist than it seems like.
I don't really. I mean, are you asking a question, or is that from your understanding?
No, that I'm asking a question. That's the appearance, it seems like, from what you were saying tonight.
Well, no, he was influenced by John Calvin in Geneva. So he did have Calvinist theology, but he stood before kings and queens. And, I believe at this period of time too, Calvin was influencing a lot of the Protestants into Calvinist theology. So.
Okay,
I believe that he was. He was influenced by Calvin.
okay.
I haven't interviewed him to know exactly how strongly he believes in all 5 points. I don't know. And actually, the 5 points of Calvinism, remember, they don't even come to be until later. We'll get to that at the end of this chapter. But so it's hard to fully know. Okay, all right. So we're on page 312, the Reformed faith in Scotland. In Scotland, John Knox led this Reformation. The Reformation flourished greatly in Scotland, and in no other area except Geneva was the influence of Calvinism so strong. So he was influenced by Calvin. John Knox can be named alongside these 3 other men, and I think we should know these are the key 4 Protestant reformers. And again, as a Baptist, I'm not a Protestant. I more identify with the radical Reformation of the Anabaptist than the Protestant Reformation. Okay, but when we're studying church history, it's good to know all of it together. But Knox can be named alongside Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli as the most influential names of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, that's basic church history. We should know that. He spent these 5 years in exile during the reign of Bloody Mary Tudor. I mentioned that in the little introduction. And it was a very bad situation in Scotland because the Roman Catholic Church was so wicked, so corrupt, so immoral. If you look in your book on page 312, and I'm getting this point right from there in the middle of that page of 312, a lack of strong leadership in Scotland. You see that paragraph in the middle? And then in the middle there, it talks about concubinage, drunkenness, simony, greed, wealth, a disregard for people characterized the leaders of the Roman Church in Scotland. They were so corrupt. So Knox does come under the influence of George Weishart as well as this other man. And George Weishart is referenced also in that next paragraph down on page 312, the man who was martyred, who was one of the influencers, if you will, mentors, teachers of John Calvin. He was burned for his faith. He was also influenced, it says in that paragraph, by the Tyndale New Testament. So that's the blank, by Tyndale's New Testament. And that's the blank there. It's up on the screen, letter C. The martyrdoms of Hamilton and Weishart, along with the copies of Tyndale's New Testament, promoted Protestant ideas. And Queen Mary of Scots is reported to have said, "I fear John Knox's prayers more than all the assembled armies of Europe." Queen Mary was a staunch Romanist. So in 1560, though, when after the exile, as I mentioned, Knox went back. The Scottish Parliament ended the rule of the popes. After that fiery sermon he did, they smashed up all their idols, declared the Mass illegal, accepted Knox's Calvinistic confession, organized the Scottish Church. And you might want to put in there somewhere that the term Presbyterian seemed to arise around 1560 in Scotland. Presbyterianism did become firmly established in Scotland. However, many Scottish Presbyterians would ultimately migrate to Northern Ireland from England in the 1600s. And this is referenced in our book on page 315, The Reformed Faith in Ireland, and also actually 314. But if you look at page 315, and this is significant for us because it's kind of, remember we mentioned the Samaritans earlier? When Israel was taken into captivity, then the kings of Assyria sent their people to migrate into Israel. So there was a migration of people from outside coming into Israel. And then there was an intermarrying, and that intermarrying between the migrants and the Jewish people developed the Samaritan ethnic group. Okay, so, but here now, it's kind of similar where Ireland was a Roman Catholic land, but the King of England, King James the First, you know who he is. That's the King James the First of the King James Bible. So he tried to bring the Protestants into Northern Ireland. He migrated many of these Protestants from Scotland into Northern Ireland to make Ireland a British land. And notice what it says here. Most of the Protestants, I'm on page 315, in the middle of that page where it says the Reformed faith in Ireland, kind of in the middle there, it says most of the Protestants were Scottish Presbyterians. They came to form the bulk of the population in the northern counties. Ulster became a Presbyterian county. Belfast became the Presbyterian city. These Scottish Presbyterians were ancestors to those now living in Northern Ireland. When England placed economic disabilities upon them before 1700s, 200,000 migrated to North America. By 1750, they planted Presbyterianism in America, particularly around what is now Pittsburgh. Now, that gets my interest for a number of reasons. One, when I was at school in Bob Jones University, we had a Presbyterian preacher named Ian Paisley come, who was from Belfast, Northern Ireland. And he always would say, I am British. And there's been a lot of controversy even to that present day that Northern Ireland is part of Britain and not a part of the rest of Ireland. It's still a controversy politically. There used to be a lot of bombings and all kinds of stuff that they would try to bring Northern Ireland back. But Paisley was staunch. And I remember one year, he couldn't even get a visa to the United States to preach at our school because our own government was so much against him. You see, because Paisley was a preacher, but also in the British Parliament, he was a politician. Like it or leave it. That's the way that's the reality. So anyway, so this is something that's carried up to the present moment. Number two, the second thing that this gets my attention, my mother was raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the Presbyterian Church. So I became a Presbyterian because my grandparents were Presbyterian, and so they had their roots from the Scottish Presbyterians. So it's had an influence in my life, what we're talking about, in those two ways. So, okay, so to this day, Northern Ireland remains more Protestant and a part of England. And this division has caused many wars and much fighting through the years. Okay. Here's just a picture when Knox did come back into the land. And if you notice on page 314 now, I tell you, it gets very confusing because like this lady, Mary Queen of Scots, she like married the King of France. And so she's got relations in England and France and Scotland. It's like, whoa, man. I mean, it's so like convoluted, but the basic point is this: Mary Stuart was a devoted Catholic, and that's what it's 3:4. I'm on 314. Her husband was the French ruler, devoted Catholic, but they had, and then it says the outspoken Knox had many interviews with this Mary Queen of Scots. So here's a picture. Here's a painting of one of these interviews. He would not yield to her tears and blandishments. Mary's domestic problems led to her final defeat. In 1565, she married her cousin, this jealous man named Darnley, who murdered her Italian secretary because he was jealous of him. He thought Mary was in love with her secretary. They had a son. So Mary, Queen of Scots, who married Darnley, had a son, one son, King James. That's their son. So she's the Queen of Scotland, but he's going to become the King of England and authorize the King James Bible. That's the King James, okay?
So next time someone asks us, oh, who was King James?
He had a good Roman Catholic mother. Okay, but then many people believe that, okay, Darnley was killed in an explosion. He was blown up in a cottage. So in these meetings with Knox, with Mary Queen of Scots, who did Knox believe had Darnley killed? Mary. He believed it was Mary who had her husband killed so she could marry somebody else. Because she had no use for Darnley. She fell in love with somebody else. Darnley was blown up. And it even says in the book, it was assumed that he had murdered Darnley. And I read in one place, because the book is good, but it sometimes doesn't give, it says that it's for example, it said Knox and Mary had many tempestuous interviews. It would get pretty tempestuous if somebody's accusing you of blowing up your husband, okay. So those are some of the disagreements they had. Plus, of course, Knox was a Protestant and she was a Catholic. So anyway, so I think a famous painting threw it in there. All right, just to close this off, the Reformed faith outside of in Holland. And now, so this is important because this still has such an effect upon theology today. I mean, now we're talking about Calvinism and Arminianism.
So, how can any authorized scripture, even though they know it was Catholic, but the scripture is going against the traditions of what is.
Yeah, well, just do you believe exactly the way your mom believes? No. My mom was a Presbyterian too, so I mean, yeah. But King James was, I don't know fully his motive, in that, but it doesn't really matter because the people who translate it were honest translators of the King James Bible. His name is obviously attached to it, but that doesn't mean he was some great Christian man. I really don't know. I mean, but he's in one of these chapters later. I don't think any of the kings of England are actually good role models myself to the present day. I don't think King Charles is. I mean, in England, the king is the head of the church. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's the head of the church. I wouldn't want King Charles the head of my church. I'm sorry. No. Okay. Jacob Arminius, 1560, 1609. He charged Calvinism with teaching that God was the author of sin. This is at the very bottom of page 317. You might want to mark that there. Mark the bottom paragraph of page 317. And let me get Micah, could you read that for us, please? That bottom paragraph. Why don't we just read that whole? Oh, you don't have your book. Okay. Okay. Maureen, are you there? Do you have the book handy? Or
Yes, Pastor.
okay, could you read that bottom paragraph on page 317? Thank you, Maureen. Always being ready. Even though I don't see you, you're always like right with us, which is very commendable. Not easy to do. Okay.
Okay. You want me to begin where it says both Arminius and Calvin?
You got it right there.
Okay. Both Arminius and Calvin taught that man who inherited Adam's sin is under the wrath of God. But Arminius believed that man was able to initiate his salvation after God had granted him the primary grace to enable his will to cooperate with God. Calvin taught that man's will had been so corrupted by the fall that salvation was entirely a matter of divine grace. Arminians accepted election, but believed that the decree to save some and damn others had its foundation in the foreknowledge of God. Thus, election was conditional rather than unconditional. Calvin, on the other hand, accepted an unconditional election by a sovereign God to grace and condemnation. Arminius also believed that Christ's death was sufficient for all, but it was efficient only for believers. Calvin limited the atonement to those elected to salvation. Arminius also taught that men might resist the saving grace of God, whereas Calvin maintained that grace was irresistible. Arminius answered The Calvinist insistence on the prevalence of the saints by stating that God will give the saints grace so that they need not fall, but that the scriptures seem to teach that it was possible for man to fall away from salvation. Armenians did not want to make God the author of sin, nor man an automaton.
A
He
machine.
thought, yeah, he thought that these modifications of Calvinism will eliminate those dangers to theology.
Okay, so generally, I agree much more with Arminians, except the point of Arminianism is that you can lose your salvation. But that's a very interesting paragraph. It kind of goes through each of the points. We don't have the time to break it all down, but notice what he's saying there, that election for Calvinism is you're elect to heaven or you're elect to hell. And that would make man a machine, an automaton, and God is so sovereign that man does not have a will. So I do reject that. And obviously the Bible does not teach that God elects anyone to hell. I don't believe, however, and be aware that like Pentecostals are hyper Arminian, or they're Arminian all the way in their theology, and that they believe you can lose your salvation. So I believe that's where most of us would definitely say, no, I'm not. So I'm not Arminian and I'm not Calvinist. That's my position, you know. Okay, so let me give you these blanks and we'll close it out. Schaff says this: Calvinism emphasizes divine sovereignty and free grace. Arminianism emphasizes human responsibility. The one restricts saving grace to the elect. The other extends it to all men on the condition of faith. Well, I believe that salvation is conditioned to all men, extended to all men on that condition of faith. Both are right in what they assert. Both are wrong in what they deny. In other words, Calvinism denies free will. Arminianism denies eternal security. So Calvinism does emphasize the sovereignty of God. God is sovereign. Arminianism emphasizes free will. Man has a free will. I believe both. And how they're fully reconciled, I don't know. And I'm happy to leave it there with God. Okay, so from 1618 to 1619, a synod was held in Dort. It was a Calvinist assembly to answer Arminians' remonstrance of 1610. So the 5 Calvinistic articles were drawn up to refute Arminius, which was called the Canons of Dort. These articles are commonly called the 5 points of Calvin. So here's one reason why you could take this class and say, oh, this is good, I'm taking this class. Because most Christians have no idea that the 5 points of Calvinism came in 1618. Calvin died in 1564. He died 50 years before the 5 points of Calvinism actually came about. Okay, so in other words, Calvin didn't sit down and write 5 points. They summarize his teachings to refute Arminius, and they came up with the 5 points of Calvinism much later than Calvin. Okay, does that make sense? And the Canons of Dort, that's the last. These were called the Canons of Dort. And then this is in that last paragraph, that letter D I'm getting from that last page 318. Kind of tried to summarize some of the things in the book. All right, so the quiz will go from page, I'll have it in your note sheet, in your study guide, but it'll go from page 17 to 27. If you want to make a note of that, from page 17 to 27. And in your quiz next week, you'll have to have read through chapter 31. I think in the first quiz it was only 26 and 27. So for the quiz next week, I will ask, have you read from chapters 28, 29, 30, 31? Should be up to that, which is the reading today. That should be the reading today. And hopefully we will get through chapter 34 in this class. But we've we've spent a little extra time, especially in chapter 28. We added a lot of information about the Anabaptists. And then I thought John Knox was of particular interest, so we spent a little extra time. Some of the chapters we will not spend as much time on. Okay? All right. Any questions or comments?
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a lot of friction online when you watch a sermon. You'll have a Calvinist preaching a sermon. Someone with sarcasm say, "Well, I'm predestined to damnation, so I can't be saved."
Yeah.
See the friction there.
We said that on the radio recently, actually, that and you know, on family radio here in New York City, for many years, Harold Camping had a big voice. Did you ever listen, or did you know of WFME, family radio, Harold Camping? He used to tell people, you could pray, you could beg God, but if you're not the elect, you can't be saved. That's what he would tell people. That is so unbiblical and so wrong, because the Bible says, believe. If you believe, you could rest that you're the elect, you know? So, yeah. Good point. Okay, good night, everyone. God bless you. Have a good night. See you next Monday.
Thank you, Pastor.
Okay, good night. God bless you all.
Pastor, can you hear
Yeah.
me?
Oh, Tim, yes. Yes.
Yes. I was just going to ask. I hadn't seen myself on the schedule, and I just now was
Oh,
looking
yeah.
at the calendar
Yeah.
when the final exam is.
When is your what are you doing? I didn't know. I don't think I have not written down when you're doing your presentation.
Okay.
So
well,
do you know
well, right?
do you know what you're doing?
Conrad Grebel.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, you did mention that to me. So why don't you do it on November 20th? Is that okay?
And actually,
Is that okay? Can
I am going to be traveling out of town. If I could do it that date, if I was able to do it remote.
How about the 27th? Would you be around on the 27th?
I'm probably driving back in. Would we be able to make a point to? I think we could. Yes.
Yeah.
Then right.
Yeah.
Then we'll just that'll actually work out great. Yeah, it would.
Or
We'll
if you want to do it next Monday, you can, but we have a quiz too. So I don't usually have a presentation with a
Right.
quiz.
Well, I don't want to cut you short on time with the quiz. So I think the 27th would be fine.
The 27th. Okay.
Yes,
I'll
let's
put you
plan for
down.
that.
Oh, and I look forward to your presentation on Conrad Grebel.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Good.
Thanks for class. I've been enjoying
Okay.
it.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, brother. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
God bless you guys.
All right.
Isaiah, be out there. Isaiah. Don't let discouragements get you down. I know that you got a little persecution about your message you gave, but it was fantastic. There was nothing wrong with that message. You gave the gospel.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you know what? Young people need to know about heaven and hell. They need to know. We can't just tell young people. How old were the age group that you were talking to that day?
They were like a range of 6 to 14.
Oh, okay. So 6-year-olds. But you know what? There's a heaven and there's a hell. So we can't really tell people there's a heaven without telling them there's a hell, you know?
Yeah.
Timmy knows there's a hell, right? Brother Tim, did you tell your son? Yeah, that there's a hell? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Why else would somebody want to be saved in a way, you know?
Yeah. Major part.
Anyway.
Yep.
God bless
Yeah.
you, brother. Continue on.
God bless you too. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.